Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about the opening of Japan, or rather the so-called opening of Japan, which was a period in the 1850s when the structure of Japanese foreign relations was refashioned because of the arrival of aggressive, well-armed, and determined Western war fleets, which demanded the establishment of diplomatic and commercial relations with Tokugawa Japan, and which the Tokugawa could no longer ignore. So the ancestral law stopped working, essentially. And it stopped working because, in part, the Western world was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. You were getting steamships now, bigger and better cannons, factories basically able to build these great machines, and then networks of supply ports around the world to supply them. You're really operating in a world where increasingly assertive Western imperial powers are expanding their influence across the globe, but you're also dealing with a time period when some weaknesses of the Tokugawa system are maturing, and it's this coincidence of the arrival of these newly assertive European basically armed trade delegations, and the development of these internal Tokugawa weaknesses that cause this process and lead to a real traumatic refashioning of Japanese foreign relations, and it's traumatic because it was imposed from the outside by these barbarians. Excuse me. I should notice that, or I should note that I have the opening of Japan in quotation marks, because of course we've seen that Japan was certainly not closed to the outside world. There is no closed country. That's a historical myth. But nevertheless, this phrase is used so often, and in many ways it is meaningful. Japan was really changed because of this process, that I think using it is acceptable and even useful if we understand that it wasn't really complete opening per se. So, after the, well, actually even before the Golovnin incident, basically throughout the late 18th century, but especially in the early 19th century, there were increasing contacts between Western ships and Japanese and samurai ashore, basically. Some of these were official missions to establish trade with Japan. We've talked about the Laxman mission, the establishment of the so-called ancestral law, then Ryazanov and the kind of the test to this ancestral law, this challenge to this, well, system of foreign relations, that was then amicably settled with the Golovnin incident. And what came out of that is basically a pattern where this ancestral law, this pattern for relations between Japan and Russia, began to be applied to relations between Japan and all other European countries except for the Dutch, and American countries as well. That is, the United States and the various states of South America. Essentially, all of these Christian foreign devils could just stay away, and there was this supposedly ancient law that, just look right here. It says, black on white. We have never had contact with peoples, or we will never establish contacts with peoples whom we haven't already had contacts with. It says it right here. Just read it. And this law was certainly the dominant narrative for dealing with, well, these Western peoples. Nevertheless, there was more contact. As we've seen, the Russians sent informal missions from 1814 all the way up till 1852, trying to establish trade and diplomacy with Japan. Other countries send diplomatic missions as well. And early U.S. mission was the mission of Commodore Biddle in 1846, where the Americans were, they sailed into Edo Bay, and they were met by samurai who stopped them from proceeding into the inner bay. So Biddle allowed his ship to be stopped. Then there was a kind of an altercation, and a samurai pushed Biddle down, pushed the chief American negotiator, this naval officer, down on the deck of his own ship. Biddle kind of laughed it off, did not make a big deal out of it because he did not want to, he kind of wanted to let this go, but the samurai saw this as a sign of weakness, and did not respect Biddle enough to give him what he wanted, certainly didn't fear him enough to give him what he wanted, which was diplomacy and trade with Japan. They told Biddle to leave, and Biddle left. So there were these official attempts to establish trade. There were also informal contacts, unofficial contacts. The Russian mission certainly, but also there was a great deal of whaling that was going on in the North Pacific. The whales there had been relatively free from overhunting, and the Atlantic whales, the supply of those was by this point apparently drying up because of the appetite of Europeans for whale oil, for basically it was the predecessor of kerosene. You lit houses with it, some other uses for it as well. Whaling was big business. More and more whaling ships in the North Pacific meant more and more ships made landfall in Japan to get water, maybe to trade for a bit of food with villagers. There were also villagers who were used to whaling ships showing up outside in the waters in the offing off of their village. So sometimes what some villagers would do was just pile a bunch of produce and water into rowboats, row out to meet these, weird European ships. Yeah, they weren't supposed to be doing it, but really the authorities could not catch them all. And they would trade for, keepsakes and minor things. So there was contact with these kinds of people. Occasionally, Westerners were also shipwrecked in Japan. That certainly did happen. And there was also informal contact by way of repatriated Japanese castaways. Many unfortunate Japanese sailors who ran into trouble on Japan's Pacific Ocean coast just continued to drift north, and they either hit the Aleutian Islands or sometimes actually made landfall in Canada, in Alaska. Lots of them were repatriated by various Russian missions. Laxman actually carried a couple of very famous castaways. Well, actually, one of them was really famous. The other one was only kind of famous. The famous one was Daikopia Kodayu, a merchant from Western Japan, from this area right here, whose ship was broken in a storm. He drifted into the Aleutian Islands. His ship just happened to be carrying rice, so he and his crew survived. And then he was rescued, made his way all the way across Russia, met Catherine the Great, saw Moscow, saw St. Petersburg, and then later became the first Japanese castaway to officially be repatriated from a European country. And Tokugawa kind of viewed him with suspicion and kept him under house arrest. He might be a spy after all, but they did allow him to come back. This opened the door for more castaways to come back from the West, and they served as a great source of information about what was going on in the outside world. And one of the things they were telling these Japanese authorities is, man, these Western ships, they're everywhere. They go wherever they want. And just by virtue of these people having been rescued by Western ships who sailed all over the world, certainly the Tokugawa knew that things were changing. More and more domains were reporting ships off of their coasts, and the Tokugawa, in the last half decade of their rule, the early 19th century, really tried several things to secure their coastline. And basically, these measures ran the gamut from allowing or actually ordering domains to shoot foreign ships on sight, all the way down to just giving Western ships food and water if they were in distress, but telling them to leave immediately. So there was a debate, there were policy shifts. The issue of foreign ships was becoming more and more pressing in Japanese politics. And then, of course, there were occasional contacts that were hostile in nature. The Khvostov-Davidov raids, which we talked about during the last lecture, and something called the Phaeton Incident. In 1808, the HMS Phaeton sailed into Nagasaki harbor and threatened to attack the Dutch factory. And this was because the Dutch had been taken over by Napoleon's France and were kind of French puppets at this time period, so the English tried to gobble up all of their colonies, and Dejima was one of these colonies. And the Tokugawa were aghast that the British were doing this, and the British said that, we can do whatever we want, our ship is more powerful, don't you see that? And the Tokugawa were forced to admit that they were very ill prepared to handle a ship like the Phaeton. If they really decided to shoot, they could possibly level Nagasaki all by themselves. Another interesting thing about this incident, the Dutch Republic had ceased to exist. Napoleon had replaced it with a puppet state called the Batavian Republic, and later the Netherlands were reorganized into a kingdom, which he sat one of his brothers on the throne of. But in any case, the Dutch colonies during this time period, because of the Napoleonic Wars, were basically operating more or less on their own. And there were not actually enough ships. In fact, there were no ships anymore coming from the Netherlands to the Dutch East India Company power center in Java, to say nothing of ships to Nagasaki. So what the Dutch colonial authorities ended up doing is they ended up hiring Americans, people from the USA, to go and work in Dejima and pretend that they were Dutch. And during the course of the Phaeton incident, all sorts of things came out, and these Tokugawa authorities were like, what do you mean these people are not Dutch? So they got into a little bit of trouble for that, but it all ended peacefully, although with the understanding of the Tokugawa that they were certainly going to have to do something about this whole issue of Western ships and the increasingly aggressive position of Western countries on the world stage during the 19th century. So there were attempts at change, and these attempts at change, winds of change, were prompted certainly by these foreign ships, also by a couple of other things. Most importantly, the Opium Wars, which was a series of two military confrontations in China, where, to make a long story short, Western imperial powers, led by Great Britain, but involving at various times France and even Russia, these imperial powers basically fought or threatened to fight China in order to gain a wide range of very significant concessions from the Chinese. The Chinese imperial government was controlling trade much too tightly for the for the likes of the British and the other European imperialist powers. They were doing all sorts of nasty things like stopping the British from selling opium and getting entire regions of China addicted. And the British were very keen to point out that no, we should have free trade. So they wanted to go to war with China essentially to prevent or to protect the rights of drug dealers. They did this, they won. And then in the Second War, they won even more concessions. Many concessions, including the right to not only import opium, but to do it legally, to basically, the opium epidemic in China was truly something that had brought entire cities to a standstill in many cases, split up great many families, the sorts of things we associate with drug epidemics. So the Europeans got to do that. The Europeans also got to take over entire sections of Chinese cities. The Europeans got other kinds of concessions. Hong Kong, for example, was ceded to Great Britain. A great stretch of territory was ceded to Russia, what is now Vladivostok and the area around it, the so-called maritime provinces. The Russians just basically threatened to go to war and didn't even have to do it, and got this gigantic area, as some historians say, the size of France and Germany put together, annexed from China in 1860. So these developments were by no means lost on the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa were being kept appraised of these events through the flow of Chinese travelers, merchants into Nagasaki, importation of books, things like encyclopedias, treatises written by Chinese government officials and scholars. And I mean, there was an exchange of information also between religious institutions, as always. So it was clear to the Tokugawa that the militarily superior Europeans had just walked in and completely whomped the Chinese, and were now in a position to extract great concessions from them. There were other avenues as well. The King of the Netherlands in 1844 sent the shogun a letter where he says, like, look, we've had a good working relationship, let me level with you, you have to change the way you're doing things, you have to establish trade with Western powers, because if you don't, the English and the French and etc. are going to come and kick your door in. And of course King William was hoping, was basically saying, you should greatly expand trade with the Netherlands, we have this relationship in Dejima, we could do more for you. And the Tokugawa officially replied, like, we do not need your advice. But of course they knew what was going on. They were thinking about these same problems, and wishful thinking was not going to make them go away. So there were some reforms, some attempts at reforms, which tried to address the issue of Japanese weakness vis-a-vis these Western powers by adopting some Western techniques and some Western knowledge. For example, there was an attempt at reforming the military by introducing what was called the Takashima Ryu, the Takashima style, in 1841. Takashima was a place where these recruits were taken to practice. And, basically what this was a updating of Japanese army tactics to be in line with stuff that you saw during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So as we see here, 3 ranks of infantry firing in volleys, coordinating large-scale maneuvers, moving as one body. The muskets themselves were improved. The traditional Japanese musket that samurai and their ashigaru retainers used, these were matchlocks, basically an older mechanism for firing a gun. These guns, used by the Takashima Ryu, reformers. These were matchlocks, or I'm sorry, these were flintlocks. You replaced a slowly burning match in the firing mechanism with a stone. It was more weatherproof. It was easier to load and operate. And a number of these guns were imported from the West and were kind of given to this experimental company. It had kind of mixed effects. It definitely demonstrated that current Japanese military tactics were somewhat outdated, and yet it didn't really amount to very much. In part, this was because of traditional samurai notions of status. In a modern European-style military, you have officers, and then you have enlisted men, and then you have ranks of officers, and that is the hierarchy. But the samurai had their own hierarchy, where a person might come under the command of a samurai who he regards as his inferior, and then these samurai also had their own ashigaru. So what you basically had was these kinds of units. They have uniforms, they look like they're all the same, but really these people might come from one samurai, and these people might come from one samurai, and then you have a whole other domain over here. These people aren't used to working with each other. They start arguing with each other. And the Takashima style doesn't really become, for cultural reasons, a viable replacement for this way of samurai fighting, which was certainly more group-oriented than it was during, the Kamakura period, but which is still really based on these kinds of feudal distinctions. So it wasn't a natural fit for Tokugawa samurai society. There were other reforms. In 1811, a translation bureau for Western books was founded in Edo. Later, this institution, as it matured in the modern period, it became the Tokyo University Historiographical Institute, still one of the two, along with the National Diet Library, one of the two greatest repositories of primary sources relating to Japanese history. It just has a tremendous amount of useful sources, and a place where I was fortunate enough to do some of my own research. This translation bureau was founded, and there were also private academies that were allowed to be founded throughout the country. Many of the best ones were in Nagasaki and Edo, also in Mito. There was a good scholarly community. And essentially, it seems on the face of it like the Bakufu is promoting limited attempts at westernization, or at least at learning from Westerners. But really, these were half-hearted measures, and as I say here, a day late and a dollar short. At the same time that, let me put it this way, the promotion of Western knowledge came in waves. And at the top of the wave, the Bakufu might support Western knowledge and promote it, and at the bottom of the wave, they might periodically persecute and imprison and even kill some people who studied Western science because someone happened to say something or come up with a dangerous idea, or question the necessity of the shogun, or do nasty things like that. Real intellectual exchange with Western scholars was taking place, but in some ways it could be limited and certainly dangerous. A German by the name of Franz von Siebold had taken a contract with the Dutch East India Company and was the physician at Dejima. He became highly regarded. Samurai got to know him. Many of them got to like him. Scholars got to know him. He was eventually allowed to live in the city of Nagasaki. He had a great passion for botany, so he used to go around and collect samples of local plant life, local wildlife as well. He was basically one of these early mid-19th century European scholars. Um, in some ways, he was a better scholar than he was well, here's what happened. One of his samurai friends gave him a map of Ezo, actually, of that northern borderland that was very accurate. There were great strides being made in cartography in Japan, and Siebold said, "Oh, thank you very much." And then he drew suspicion to himself for something unrelated. The Tokugawa searched his belongings when he was leaving, and they found this map of Ezo that his friend had given him. This map was actually a classified military map. Siebold's friend lost his life. Siebold was banned from Japan for life, although he does eventually come back. This happened in 1829, and so the Tokugawa were not promoting international intellectual exchange because they saw it as a virtue. Also, in other ways, the Tokugawa response to the military superiority of the Westerners was not very effective. As I said earlier, some of the measures the Tokugawa were taking in trying to safeguard Japan against foreign ships, Western ships, was ordering local garrisons to fire on any Western ships on sight. This was promulgated in 1825 as the Ninen Naku Edict, basically the Don't Think Twice, Shoot Edict, which was enforced from 1825 to 1842. So this wasn't really meant to sink Western ships, it was meant to frighten them away, but it was also clear that this was a response that was completely unsuited to the situation. In many cases, if you fired on for example, a Western warship, they just get really mad, and their cannons were better, and they could blow any Japanese guns out of the water, and they could go in and level a city if they actually wanted to. So what ended up happening is many local samurai just fired blanks or fired off to the side, and it was clear that if any Western ships were to try to retaliate, the local defenders were doomed. So sometimes they didn't bother firing at all. Many local authorities did not report sightings of Western ship to the Tokugawa because of this. And it was just seen as something that was not really effective. And in 1842, this edict was repealed, and the Tokugawa basically said, okay, now give them food and water and tell them to leave. So there were these vacillations in policy as well. And there was a sense that the Tokugawa weren't really clear on how to deal with these increasing numbers and frequencies of Western ships showing up in their waters, especially given what just happened in China with the Opium War. The Tokugawa's response was thus certainly inadequate, but interestingly, and we'll come back to this point later, many of the individual domains launched their own reform programs, and in many of those domains, in some of those domains rather, including those domains that became the enemies of the Tokugawa shortly afterwards, some of these reforms were much more successful. So this is not necessarily the failure of these reforms is not necessarily reflective of the samurai as a whole, but this was certainly a problem for the Tokugawa. Their authority was eroding. They weren't quite sure how to prop it up.